Good morning, everybody. Today's proceedings are going to be live streamed. Those in the hearing room with electronic devices may use them to report what they have heard, but only after 15 minutes have elapsed since the event that they're reporting. Those devices may not be used for recording what is heard. Thank you. Yes.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Could I ask you first to state your name, please?
Malcolm MacLeod.
Thank you, Mr. MacLeod. You should, I hope, have in front of you a copy of a witness statement that you made to this inquiry dated the 21st of July of 2023.
Correct.
Do you recall making that statement?
Yes.
And are its contents true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Thank you. That will stand as your written evidence to the inquiry. What I'm going to do today and tomorrow is ask you some questions about certain parts of it. Do you follow?
I do.
You were the Detective Chief Inspector of the unit known as the Special Demonstration Squad between November 1986 and September 1987, is that right?
Yes.
And before you took up that role, you explain in your witness statement that you were on C Squad in Special Branch from September 1985, which included a stint from then on the what was known as the Alternatives Desk, is that
Correct.
right? And that included, the Alternatives Desk included looking at left-wing extremism and animal rights extremism, is that right?
That is right.
You were promoted in May of 1986 to the rank of Detective Chief Inspector, is that right?
That is right.
And having been promoted, that's how you found yourself as Detective Chief Inspector of the SDS in November 1986, is that
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So that was, in essence, your first role in the rank of Detective Chief Inspector.
Yes.
You explain in your witness statement that you became aware of the existence of the SDS around 4 years into your service in Special Branch. And your witness statement explains that you joined Special Branch in 1969.
Yes.
You describe the SDS as a well-guarded secret in your witness statement. So can I ask, how did you become aware of it?
Through word of mouth by other colleagues who had, who actually were aware of the SDS and shared information. So it became kind of common knowledge.
And when you say it became common knowledge, do you mean it was known about by lots of people within Special Branch, or it became common knowledge amongst a smaller group?
Amongst a smaller group.
And when you were made aware of it, was it directly in connection with work that you were doing, or was it spoken about more informally?
About work I was doing. Okay.
Right, just in case it's not clear, there's some something going on with the microphone, it appears. So it's just been moved closer to you, Mr. MacLeod. If we try again, was it spoken about informally, or was it spoken about in connection with your work?
It would have been in connection with my work.
And when you first learnt about it, what did you understand about the unit?
It was a covert operation which is funded by the Home Office to obtain intelligence on the activities of various left-wing and right-wing activists.
Did you learn anything about how it operated day to day when you first learnt about it, or did you only learn about that once you were in the unit?
I only learned about that when I joined the unit.
Can I ask you a couple of questions about the Alternatives Desk in C Squad that you were on before you went to the SDS? You mention in your statement, I think, that it included looking at groups such as London Greenpeace and animal rights activism. Is that right?
That's correct.
So by the time you joined the SDS, did you have some familiarity from an intelligence gathering perspective with the sorts of groups that it turned out the SDS were infiltrating too?
Yes.
Were you aware when you were on the alternatives desk of being in receipt of intelligence from the SDS?
Yes.
And were you aware of that because you already knew about the existence of the SDS, so you were able to discern that it was coming from the unit, or were you told that explicitly?
No, I knew it was coming from the unit.
Did somebody tell you that explicitly, or was it because you knew what you were looking for?
It's what it's what I was looking for.
If we put up on the screen an example report from your time on C Squad, just to have a look at what it might have looked like, please. MPS 0742828, and it's a report dated the 27th of August 1986, so just a few months before you joined the SDS. And can we focus on this cover page, please? Mr. MacLeod, we see on the top half of the page a minute signed off by, as he was then Detective Chief Inspector Waite, who at the time was the Detective Chief Inspector within the SDS. Do you see that?
Yes.
And he has dated it the 27th of August of 1986. And then if we look at the bottom half of that minute sheet, that cover sheet, we see that you signed off a handwritten list, in effect. And would it be right to understand that at 1, 2, 3, and 4, the points we see numbered on the page, that's you deciding or indicating to whom the report should be disseminated?
That's correct.
So, for example, at number 2, we see the name of a detective inspector in ARNI. That's the Animal Rights National Index, isn't it?
Yes.
And if we look at the content of the report, we would see that it's a report about animal rights matters. So what we see here is you in receipt of intelligence from the SDS during your time on the alternatives desk. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
And your responsibility being to annotate it and decide to whom it will be disseminated.
Correct.
Was it fairly routine to send, for example, animal rights reporting to ARNI in your time on that desk?
Yes.
Did all reporting go to ARNI, or did you select which reports should go to them?
In the main, the majority of reports went to ARNI.
Could I ask you to explain a little about ARNI? Because I think after your time on the SDS, you had a role that included line managing part of ARNI, didn't you?
That's correct.
Could you explain what ARNI was in a couple of sentences?
The Animal Rights National Index had its origins in Essex Police, where there was a detective constable there who was a collator for the intelligence in the sort of Essex southeast area, and that was information that was fed into the branch. And at some point, and I can't remember the date, the Home Office established the Animal Rights National Index, given the amount of disruption that had been caused at various events, whether it was the it was considered it was important to have an index that could be shared with other police forces throughout the country because of the growing problems and menaces posed by the animal rights groups. So yes, it was financed by the Army. As I said before it was established, it was a small group in the Collector's office in Essex, if I recall. When it was decided for the Home Office to set this up, it was set up, and they had an office in Scotland Yard, and the operation was funded by the Home Office, and the intelligence that was shared on the RNA, it would get selected information, but it didn't always give necessarily the originator of the intelligence. In other words, they weren't aware it was coming from the SDS.
Right, so they might receive intelligence that had come from an SDS officer, but not be told that that's where it had come from.
Correct.
And was that routine, that they were kept unaware, or did it just depend on the circumstances?
No, it's routine.
So routinely they wouldn't be aware.
They wouldn't be aware
where the intelligence was coming from.
No.
And when you describe it as an index,
Yes.
do you mean by that it was a repository for storing intelligence or something else?
Yes.
So they received intelligence from various sources and
Yes.
filed it.
Yes.
And was that repository available, for example, to you to consult if you needed to?
Yes.
Was that repository stored in your era in Scotland Yard?
Yes.
In your witness statement, you described that the relationship between the SDS and Arnie was excellent. And you said that any information coming out of Arnie fed back into the SDS and vice versa. Can I ask you what you mean by that? So you've explained that intelligence might go out of the SDS and to Arnie, but without them knowing the source. In what way or ways did information from Arnie come into the SDS?
It would come in. The collator who set up the index to begin with, he was transferred to Scotland Yard, so he was one of the staff there. I think there was about 3 or 4 of them, who so they were recipients of the intelligence that was coming from other parts of the country as well, where there were various incidents. So the intelligence was it was intelligence. It was the intelligence was. Can you just repeat the question?
Yes, of course. Perhaps I'll ask it in a slightly different way. When you were the Detective Chief Inspector of the SDS, for example, were you receiving intelligence from Arnie in that role?
Yes.
And how did that come about? Were you asking for it? Was it routinely provided to you?
Routinely provided.
And by what method was it routinely provided?
On paper.
But did somebody, for example, deliver to you every week a batch of reports from Arnie, or was it less organised than that? Can you give us an idea?
No, Arnie would send up with a minute sheet to the to my desk, and then I would cascade that accordingly.
And was that in your role as Detective Chief Inspector of the SDS?
Yes.
To what extent then were you informed by the work of Arnie in performing your role in the SDS, do you think?
Well, it was a vital piece of information. It was the first time that the police forces of England and Wales we were able to share the intelligence with the rest of the police forces in the country. So yes, it was an important part of our job to notify these, well, it would be the Arnie under Detective Superintendent.
I won't ask you to use a name just in case the name is subject to a restriction.
Right.
But there was a detective superintendent in charge of Arnie
Yes.
that you recall. Could I ask you, changing topics slightly, about a particular incident that you recall in your witness statement, please? And to assist you, we'll put it on the screen. It's page 6, paragraph 15, please. Oh, I'm sorry, MPS 0748808. Page 6, paragraph 15, which takes up most of the page. Thank you. Mr. MacLeod, you explain in this paragraph contacts that you had with the SDS before you joined the SDS. Do you follow?
Yes.
And I want to ask you, about halfway down the paragraph, about halfway across the page, there is a sentence that begins, "At some point I spoke to the SDS DI." Do you see that?
Yes.
At some point I spoke to the SDS DI, whose name I cannot recall, about the issues surrounding animal rights activities. I cannot recall what issue prompted the discussion. I telephoned him. Thus, my contact with the SDS was primarily through receipt of written intelligence, although there was at least one telephone contact. To ask for a meeting would have been relatively rare, but I do seem to recall a meeting that I attended. I cannot remember at what juncture during my time in the alternatives this came about. It took place in a pub, but I do not remember specifically where. The purpose of the meeting was for me to better understand the animal rights scene. Those present at the meeting included Eric Docker, Bob Lambert, and possibly Mike Chitty. The UCOs briefed me on the animal rights scene. I just want to ask you a few questions about that meeting. You say there to ask for a meeting would have been relatively rare, and this is the only meeting that you recall. Is it likely that it's the only meeting that you attended with SDS officers before you joined the SDS?
I can't remember.
But you do recall this meeting?
I do.
And are you confident that those present included Eric Docker, Bob Lambert, and possibly Mike Chitty?
To the best of my recollection.
When you say that the undercover officers briefed you on the animal rights scene, do you recall for what purpose you had that briefing?
Well, as I had a remit for the animal rights activities, that was the purpose of the meeting, is to obtain information from them and to better understand how the RNA sort of system could work to the beneficial benefits of the rest of the police forces.
So a general briefing,
It's a general briefing,
rather than seeking specific information from them. Is that a fair summary?
I would have thought it was a general briefing rather than a specific.
And can you recall at all what prompted you to seek a meeting with undercover officers from the SDS?
I think that's because there was a proliferation of sort of activist activity and it was a way of just gathering information about the various groups, like London Greenpeace and so forth.
Do you recall learning anything about how the officers went about gathering intelligence when you met with them?
No, I didn't.
Did you form any view of Robert Lambert or Mike Chitty as a result of the meeting?
Well, they were the two sort of key undercover officers who had different areas of responsibility. So they were in the best position to give me the information I needed.
All right, thank you. Finally, could I just ask you briefly about what happened after you were the Detective Chief Inspector of the SDS? You describe in your witness statement that you were promoted, I think, to Detective Superintendent in September of 1987, and that in effect prompted you to move away from the SDS, is that right?
Yes.
So you were promoted on the way in and then promoted again on the way out, in effect?
I think I was the Chief Inspector, I'd been promoted Chief Inspector before I left C Squad. I was promoted Superintendent at a later stage. I'm trying to recall at what point I was promoted Superintendent.
Your witness statement suggests it was September of 1987, so shortly before you left the SDS. Does that sound about right?
That sounds right, yes.
And then once you were in the Detective Superintendent role and had left the SDS, you were in C Squad again, is that right?
That's correct.
Did you maintain an awareness of the work of the SDS in that role?
Yes.
And was that similar to the awareness you'd had before you joined the SDS in terms of your day-to-day work?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Change of topic now, please, to some general questions about the management of the SDS, so when you were in role. When you first became the Detective Chief Inspector of the SDS, it is right, I think, that you had no first-hand experience of undercover deployments of police officers, is that right?
That's right.
And you were new to the day-to-day operation of the SDS.
Yes.
Although you knew about its existence, you hadn't had any day-to-day interaction with its operation, is that right?
That's correct.
When you joined, Mr. Docker, Eric Docker, was the Detective Inspector of the unit, wasn't he?
Correct.
And he himself had never been an undercover officer, and neither had you, is that right?
Correct.
Did you know when you joined the unit that Eric Docker had only been the Detective Inspector for about 7 months?
I can't remember.
Do you remember whether you had a feeling that he was fairly new to the role or whether he seemed bedded in by the time you got there?
He seemed to me at the time to be fairly bedded in.
He's told the inquiry that he had no handover from his predecessor, who was Detective Inspector Barber. You describe having an informal handover from your predecessor, Detective Chief Inspector Waite, is that right?
That's right, yes.
I just want to explore a little bit the nature, the form of that handover. In your witness statement, you describe it as more than adequate and very helpful. Can you describe in what ways it was very helpful?
Well, given that it was much a learning curve for me as anybody else, because I honestly can't remember.
When you were moved to the STS to be its Detective Chief Inspector, would it be fair to say you had no familiarity with what your job was going to entail day to day?
Yes, that's true.
And did you rely to a large extent, if not entirely, on Detective Chief Inspector Waite then to tell you what the job entailed?
Yes.
Did he tell you something about the individual officers who were deployed undercover?
Yes, he did, yes.
Did that form take the form of a sort of pen picture of every undercover officer?
Yes.
Every single one that was deployed?
Yes.
And did he, for example, tell you whether any of them were having any issues that you should be aware of, whether welfare issues or trouble in their deployment, that sort of thing?
Not that I remember.
Did he give you any indication of whether he thought some officers were performing better than others, for example? Some stars, some not so productive?
Yes, I believe he did.
And do you remember, for example, whether he said anything to you about Robert Lambert at that stage?
No, I can't remember specifically him talking about Bob Lambert. No, I can't remember that.
The words that Mr. Waite used when he gave evidence to the inquiry were that Lambert had told him at a certain point that he had gotten a girl into trouble, meaning that Lambert thought he'd made a woman pregnant. Is that information that Mr. Waite passed on to you?
No.
Is it information, looking back, that it would have been helpful for you to have known about as you entered into the Chief Inspector role at the SDS?
Most certainly.
And had you been told, what would your reaction have been?
Given the implications of it, my initial instinct would be to try to find from Eric just the extent of this, and I would have to take into account the possible repercussions it would have, not just for the individual but for the operation. So to answer your question, I would almost certainly have raised it with the commander.
With the commander?
Yes.
Would you have taken any steps to speak about it with Bob Lambert, do you think?
Well, I didn't have the opportunity. I wasn't aware of that situation with this female.
Looking back to the point at which you joined the unit, now, in retrospect, do you feel that you had sufficient experience or guidance to enable you to do the job that you were being asked to do?
I think I've had sufficient experience to make a decision on something like that, which could impinge on the individual himself and the impact on his role as an undercover officer. So you don't have to have any particular experience. Common sense would tell you that something would have to be done if you had an officer who has erred, and it's something that could impact on the operation itself. It's not something that could be buried under the carpet. So to answer the question, that's something I would have followed up most certainly had I known about.
And what about more generally in terms of the day-to-day management of the SDS? Do you feel that when you started in your role, you had enough information, enough experience to know what was expected of you?
No, I didn't. It was very much a case of learning on the job.
And looking back, do you feel that put you at any disadvantage in terms of
Well,
being
yeah,
able to manage the unit?
well, I felt I managed, in my opinion, I think I managed to run the unit as efficiently as I could. I don't think I don't think it would have impacted, even if I knew about it. I would still have sufficient. No, I'm not. I don't think it would have impacted.
In your witness statement, you describe being asked to serve in that role as an honour. You say it was also an honour to be thought to possess the necessary skills.
Yes.
Can you describe why you viewed it as an honour to be offered the role of Chief Inspector in the SDS?
Well, it was quite a unique group of people who volunteered to serve undercover. They were making great sacrifices in being away from their family for various lengths of time. It was they chose to do this job because out of sense of duty. I thought they were an admirable bunch of guys and girls, and to me it was quite an insight, having been for the best part of my career involved in general special branch work. This was quite a different ball game altogether. From day one, and from talking to them during the weekly briefings, meetings, I just you do get a sense of what sorts of characters are, and why they're doing what they're doing. It is quite a sacrifice for these officers. So yes, it was an honour for me to actually to have been their boss.
Is your view about that affected at all, knowing now what, for example, Robert Lambert and Mike Chitty were doing during their deployments? For example, having relationships with women, multiple relationships, sexual and intimate relationships. Does that change your view when you described them as an admirable bunch, and that it was an honour to manage them?
Well, it certainly did, yes.
And can you expand in what ways? How has it changed your reflection?
Well, it was totally unacceptable behaviour, to the point of being disreputable.
I'll come back a bit more to that topic later on. Briefly, can I ask you about visits from more senior managers, so those in the chain above you, whilst you were on the SDS? And we'll use a document to assist you, MPS 0728976. And Mr. MacLeod, this is the annual report, the SDS annual report, covering the period when you were in the SDS. And can we turn please to page 14 and paragraph 13. The report records that on the 19th of February 1987 there was a visit from the Assistant Commissioner of Specialist Operations, Mr. J.A. Dello, CBE, and the Deputy Assistant Commissioner of Special Branch, Mr. Crawshaw, QPM. The meeting took place at a West London safe flat, and the report says it was conducted in a constructive and friendly manner, and a useful exchange of views took place concerning all aspects of the SDS operation. This visit was viewed by all officers as a success. Do you recall the visit by those two senior officers to the SDS during your time in charge?
Yes.
And were all the undercover officers present when they visited?
I can't answer that. I would have thought so, but there may have been absentees, but I would have thought for the best part it would be the full team.
Would the expectation have been that everybody should attend
Yes.
if they could?
Yes, yes.
And likewise, what the inquiry is referring to as the management team or the back office team, so the detective sergeants, the detective inspector and
Yes.
you,
Yeah.
would the expectation be that all of you should also be present for this visit?
Yes, most certainly.
You say in your witness statement that the purpose of this visit would have been to brief the senior officers on the work of the SDS
Yes.
and to provide an opportunity for them to ask or answer questions. When you say it was an opportunity for them to be briefed, to what level of detail would they have been briefed in terms of the SDS's work?
Well, the individual officers would give a summary of their areas of responsibility, and if they had any questions of the senior officers, they would have an opportunity to put these questions to the senior officers. So the benefit would be two-way, both for the senior officers to get an understanding of the role of the SDS and the type of intelligence that they're seeking to provide. And I guess the senior officers would have gained some insight, at least, into the workings of the SDS.
Right, so that would have covered, would it, the broad topic areas of deployment? So, for example, this is Mike Chitty, he's deployed into the animal rights field.
Yes.
Would it have descended, or do you recall whether it did descend to specific details of how the officers went about their roles?
I doubt that very much, that they would have gone into that kind of detail.
Did you form an impression of whether these senior officers had an idea already when they turned up about what the SDS was doing, or did it seem to be news to them?
I can't really answer that, how they perceived it to be. They sent a very gracious note, a memo afterwards, thanking us for the opportunity to address the meeting, but no, apart from that, there was nothing else.
Can you recall anything of the types of questions they asked, if any, of the officers?
I cannot. It's too long ago.
You also say in your witness statement that the meeting with the senior officers demonstrated the value of the work that the undercover officers were doing. Can you explain how it demonstrated the value of their work?
It's very difficult to quantify that. I'm just sort of hazarding a guess here that they would have been apprised of some of the successes that the SDS had over the 12 months, and how that was beneficial to the recipients of the SDS product, uniformed police and so forth. So I think they would have appreciated, but it's difficult to quantify to what extent.
Well, by successes, do you mean intelligence provided that was of assistance to policing more widely?
Correct.
All right, thank you. We can take that document down. I want to move to ask you some questions, please, Mr. MacLeod, about how undercover officers were selected for service on the SDS. And I think, could we have up on the screen, please, Mr. MacLeod's witness statement, MPS 0748808, page 10, paragraph 25. At the bottom of the page, thank you. In your witness statement, Mr. MacLeod, you describe that the process for selection of undercover officers began with nominations from the detective chief inspectors in the various special branch squads of suitable candidates to assign to the SDS. The candidates' supervisors were the best people to talk to in order to gauge their suitability. And then you go on, I'll just summarise, you go on to describe that candidates put forward would be interviewed. And if we can go, thank you, over the page, at the end of paragraph 25, you say, from what I can recall of the interview process, the candidates were asked what they believed the role to entail, its disadvantages and advantages. The first question I want to ask you is this. If the SDS was not widely known about, how would the detective chief inspectors from other squads be in a position to assess someone's suitability for an undercover role on the SDS?
I think the supervising officers that this information could provide, particularly for the role that's envisaged that you should take up in the SDS. No, it's difficult to see how that supervising officer could be aware of the apart from the fact that they're gathering information and intelligence in a broad sense, and how they might how they might cope with the pressures of working undercover. It's difficult to get an idea of what these senior officers who are sponsoring or recommending somebody for duty on the SDS. It can only just be but just an opinion, if you like, of somebody's personality, commitment. That's about the only way they could find out, but I can't see how they could contribute necessarily to the suitability of the officer, other than if the officer there was something in his character that would render him unsuitable. So I can't see how the supervising officers in other squads are sort of the best people to provide that kind of. It's a very much a personal opinion.
But those were the opinions that you were reliant on.
Yes, it was.
In terms of recommendations.
Yeah.
In the era when you served in the unit.
Yeah. No, I can't. Looking at it now, I can't see how you could have come to that opinion.
It is the reality, looking back, that you were reliant on people to make recommendations, but those people didn't in fact have much of an idea whether the officers would turn out to be suitable.
Well, I mean, yeah, yes, that has to be said, yes. That is true.
And likewise, in terms of the interview process, you say the candidates were asked what they believed the role to entail, its disadvantages and advantages. Would it be likely that those coming to interview themselves had a fairly limited understanding of what the role would in fact entail because of its nature?
Most certainly, yeah.
And because it was kept so secret, it wouldn't have been explained to them in advance.
Right.
Could we have a look, please, at paragraph 25A, just further down, page 11, please? Mr. MacLeod, you say in your witness statement there that your role in the selection process was chairing the selection panel. You can speak to the only occasion that you remember. I'm not going to ask you about that officer because you'll see there are redactions in your statement. But you go on to say, I'm not sure if Eric met with the officer's wife beforehand, but I believe he would have. What was the purpose, or what would have been the purpose, as far as you're concerned, of meeting with a prospective officer's spouse during the selection process?
I would have said it was imperative.
But why was it imperative?
It's imperative in as much that the families, the wives, spouses, partners, would have to understand the pressures that are going to be placed on their husbands or partners, whatever. It's a long time, 4.5 years, working in circumstances that the families would be unacquainted with, and the pressures that it brings on the individual officer. So there is the families can only but have a sort of a brief understanding of what the work is going to entail. It's only when they get into the job they realise the length of times they're going to be spending away from the family home. So that is the kind of sacrifices the officers had to make, and it was important that the families understood that too.
Was the concern, such as it was, to look out for the welfare of the spouse and family members, or to look out for the welfare of the undercover officer, or both?
Well, you can't sort of monitor how a family is responding to the lengthy absenteeism of their husbands, but the officers themselves would be the officers themselves would have
Don't worry at all. Let me ask it this way. Did you consider it any part of your role to take steps to check on the welfare of the families of the undercover officers under your command?
I didn't take it upon myself to seek that information out.
Were there any provisions in place that the families could access or use if they did have any concerns whilst their spouse or family member was deployed undercover?
Sadly not.
And why do you say sadly?
I don't know what one could do to ameliorate that, because it was all very new to the officers, to the families. I suppose they adjust to the periods that the undercover officers are away from home. It's very difficult to give an answer to that because I think it is more complicated.
Did you, for example, have any sort of open lines of communication with the spouses or families of the undercover officers so that if they were concerned when their spouse was away for a long period of time, uncontactable, they could check in with you to see if you knew they were safe?
No, we didn't.
You explain elsewhere in your witness statement that there was a preference for potential recruits to be married or in a long-term relationship. And you say because it keeps them anchored, the support of a partner who understands the pressures of the job can do an enormous amount to keep the officer stable. To what extent did you consider that it was the status of being married or in a long-term relationship that was required to anchor an officer, as opposed to, for example, living with a close sibling or a parent?
I hadn't really given much thought to them living with a sibling or a parent, but for spouses, partners, it would be very important for them to. I suppose it's very much a case of adapting to the changed circumstances. That they, I suppose, accept that that's what the job entails. So I'm not really sure that there's very much one could have done. It was just the nature of the job.
But in terms of looking for recruits who were married, what was it about being married that was considered to be important?
Well, I do believe it does help to form, if you like, an anchor with their real lives. And I think that probably holds a lot of sway when compared with perhaps a single officer who doesn't have that home life or that stability, if you like, to keep them on the straight and narrow.
Was there any sense in which it was thought that a married officer would be less likely to enter into a sexual relationship whilst undercover?
Well, I guess, that was the received wisdom at the time. With the benefit of hindsight now, I'm not so sure that carries so much weight,
But at the time, you think it would have influenced the idea that a married officer would be better than a single officer?
Yes.
Was it seen to be part of the spouse's role then to help to keep the officer stable and on the straight and narrow?
Well, I can't answer that because one doesn't know how individual officers manage their family affairs. It's not something we would be expected to know.
But were you expecting that a spouse might perform that role? Is that part of why you wanted married officers?
Yes, I suppose it was. It's... Yeah, I think it probably it does help to keep them together. I think there is for a single officer, there's a risk that he may go back to his own flat or home, and there isn't anyone there to share any anxieties she might have. So a single person has a disadvantage and may resort to alcohol or whatever so there is a risk. It's not to say that married men going back home wouldn't indulge in alcohol. I mean, that would be ridiculous. But for single men who are on their own, there's more likely to be a tendency to, perhaps, and I think there is evidence to show that there had been casualties on the SDS where alcohol was a problem.
Could I ask you to look at something you said to Operation Hearn? Do you remember speaking to Operation
Yes.
Hearn? I think you gave a witness statement back in 2012, but I want to ask you to look, please, at some notes that the Operation Hearn officers took. It's MPS 0726 640, page 3. So this is not your signed witness statement, Mr. MacLeod, but it's the notes that the officers who spoke to you took before they drafted your statement. Can we focus in, please, just under the heading UCOs, the first few paragraphs? Thank you. Right, Mr. MacLeod, they said this: MacLeod described the selection process at the time as, quote, pretty piss poor, end quote. He believes that there should have been a mental aptitude test in place prior to officers joining the SDS. Do you stand by, albeit that it's informal, that description of the selection process at the time that you were in charge of the unit?
Well, firstly, apologies for the language. Yes, I do. I do believe there should have been some psychometric testing. I think that has since been adopted. It's come in, well, it came in I think quite a number of years ago. But I can recall being, and I can't remember what particular event it was, whether it was at the Staff College at Bramshill or whether it was at Hendon. I can remember this whole thing about aptitude tests. I think it's, I think, and I thought at the time, more could have been done to have improved the system. It's always easy with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight to make these comments, but that was my thinking at the time. It was I'm sure we could have done better than what we did. Basically, that's what I'm saying.
So at the time, you thought that improvements could have been made to the selection process. Other than the introduction of a mental aptitude test or similar, did you think there was anything else that could have been improved?
Not that I recall, but I'm sure there might have been.
And given that you noticed it at the time, did you take any steps to, for example, notify more senior officers that you thought some changes were in order, some improvements?
Not that I recall.
In your witness statement, when you were asked about what you had told Operation Hearn, you described this being prompted in part by what you had learned about Mike Chitty and how he behaved during his deployment. Was it your view, or is it your view now, that some sort of aptitude test would have been sufficient to weed out a candidate like Mike Chitty? Or do you think more was required than just that?
Once again, I think more could have been done to weed out people like Chitty.
And what more do you think could have been done? What steps? Whether at selection or later?
And I'll come back to the psychometric testing again. That might have been a possible sort of yardstick. But other than that, I can't honestly recall it.
So I'll come back to some questions about Mike Chitty's deployment later. When you were the Detective Chief Inspector of the unit, the inquiry understands that 3 officers joined the unit. I'm not going to use the names of some of them, all right? So I'll ask you to look at the cipher list for some of them. The 3 officers who joined whilst you were the Detective Chief Inspector were, don't say the name, HN87.
Yes.
Right, that individual has anonymity over their real name, but deployed, we know, into animal rights groups.
Yes.
The second I'm going to ask you about, again, don't say the name, HN25.
Oh yes. Yep.
Yep, deployed into the Troops Out movement. And the third officer, whose name I can say was John Dines, recruited whilst you were the Detective Chief Inspector of the SDS. According to the documents the inquiry has found, he joined in or around May 1987 whilst you were there.
Right.
And of those 3 officers recruited whilst you were in post, the evidence before the inquiry indicates that 2 of them, John Dines and HN87, engaged respectively in a sexual relationship, a long-term relationship, John Dines with Helen Steele, and in HN87's case he has admitted to some sexual activity with a number of women whilst deployed. Very short term is his evidence. Given that 2 of the 3 officers recruited on your watch engaged in that behaviour, do you think there's anything more that you could have done or ought to have done at the selection stage to guard against that happening?
You know, with a bit of a hindsight, perhaps something should have been done, but if you ask me what could have been done, if they're predisposed to having this kind of relationship, no matter what our views and morals might be, trying to identify that prior to engagement would have been very difficult. If somebody is so minded to stray like that, it's pretty abhorrent. But I'm not really sure there would be an effective way of preventing that apart from warning them and making sure that this is just totally unacceptable. Difficult to see how, when they're living in an isolated environment, with these opportunities to develop relationships, no matter how abhorrent we regard that, I'm not sure prior to engagement that we could have prevented it. I think it can only come from just reminders at the time of recruitment, just to reinforce that as best you can. But no, it's that's as far as I can answer.
I'll come back to ask you some questions about later stages and whether anything could be done later on. I'm going to move now, please, to some questions about what training and guidance there was in place for undercover officers who joined the unit. And can we have on the screen, first of all, please, paragraph 72 of your witness statement, page 30 of MPS 0748808. At the bottom of the page, paragraph 72, you said this, Mr. MacLeod: I was aware of a binder containing guidance for UCOs, primarily on creating their legend. I would not say it was concerned much with how UCOs should and should not behave whilst deployed undercover. It was not known to me by the term tradecraft manual. It was a binder in the back office in a secure cupboard. I read it within a month of joining the unit. It was important for me to understand the UCO's deployments. I did not have to refer to it often, if ever again. Would it be correct to understand from your evidence there that this binder was not in any way considered a secret or clandestine bit of guidance? It was open and acknowledged within the unit?
It was within the unit. It was accessible.
And was it something to which the attention of new recruits was specifically drawn?
Yes.
Did you draw it to their attention, or did you rely on others in the office to do so?
I can't remember, but I would have thought that Eric or one of the office staff would have made sure that this is information. It's critical to their employment.
We see there in paragraph 72A, that you believe the manual went back to 1968 and the genesis of the SDS. You say it came about by default. People just add their experiences and advice to it. So does it follow that you didn't consider it to be a sort of official guidance manual, but rather something that had grown up organically through the life of the unit?
That's right.
And to be based on the experiences of individuals rather than a sort of corporate set of rules or regulations?
Correct.
Was there anything in it when you read it that you considered was inappropriate in terms of guidance or advice to prospective undercover officers?
No, not that I can recall.
If there had been, do you think you would recall it?
Yes.
And do you think you would have done anything if you'd read in that binder something which you considered to be inappropriate?
I'd like to think so, yes.
And what might you have done? What were the options open to you?
Have a conversation with Eric, and we would have tried to deal with that internally in the office.
Was there any system in place for deciding who should contribute to the binder? Or again, was that left more organic so that people could contribute if they wanted to and not if they didn't?
I think it was more organic, from what I recall.
And how authoritative was this guidance considered to be by you?
Well, bear in mind, I was pretty new to the unit and to the and how it operated. It appeared to me at the time to be sufficiently adequate.
That answers as to its adequacy. Did you think, or did you consider that it should be viewed by the officers as authoritative? So was it the last word in how they should act, or something less formal than that?
Well, it should have been.
You go on in your witness statement to describe that the binder dealt primarily with how officers should go about building up their legends.
Yes.
Did it also contain any guidance or advice about how the officers should conduct themselves once they were in the field?
I don't believe it did.
Could I ask you to look at another part of your witness statement in terms of what guidance there was in that regard? Paragraph 78, please, on page 33. Thank you. And you were asked, when giving your witness statement, about something you said to Operation Hearn, which was that the UCOs, quote, all knew the boundaries, end quote. And you say this: I meant that they were adults and they should know the dictates of moral and common sense. There are certain things you do and do not do. There are fundamental principles that you adhere to, whatever role you are in. These include moral principles. Decency and probity were qualities we looked for in officers. They were also police officers who had been trained within the Metropolitan Police Service and Special Branch. I did not satisfy myself in the case of every individual officer that they knew all the boundaries, but felt that I could safely assume it to be true. If you didn't discuss the boundaries with the officers, how were they to identify where management considered those boundaries to be?
Well, I would have thought it really should have been a condition of their deployment that they should be apprised of this.
Would you accept that this approach to the identification of boundaries or lines relies on each officer's subjective, their own personal appreciation of where lines and boundaries should be?
Yes.
So it's quite possible on this approach, isn't it, that you might have an officer in the SDS who thought the boundaries were in a completely different place to where you thought they should be?
I'm sure that's true.
Did you take any steps to inform the officers of where you thought the boundaries were?
No, unless I had reason to.
And when you say unless you had reason to, do you mean unless something came to your attention particularly,
Yeah.
which
Yes.
prompted you to do so?
Yeah.
So when these officers were recruited, for example, those recruited when you were the Detective Chief Inspector, there was no, for example, no sit down with you at which you set out the do's and don'ts of behaviour as an undercover officer?
No.
Do you think, looking back, it might have been a good idea to have that sort of conversation with them?
Most certainly.
And why do you think now, most certainly, it would have been a good idea, even though it didn't occur to you at the time?
No, just a simple reason that it's, as I say, we keep coming back to this 20/20 hindsight. Had I known then what I know now, yes, we should have done.
Can I ask you about another part of your witness statement, please? Paragraph 23, page 10. you're talking here about after your time in the SDS, and you say this about your service in the SDS. It gave me a better understanding of that particular aspect of the work, which now formed one part of my command in C Squad. It opened my eyes to the risks associated with undercover work, such as risk of compromise and risk of aberrant behaviour, for example with alcohol. It was a salutary lesson in terms of human frailty. Now you give an example there of aberrant behaviour as being with alcohol, and we know, I'm not going to go into the detail, but we know that during your time there was an officer who committed an offence of driving with excess alcohol, a drink drive offence. When you say, though, it was a salutary lesson in terms of human frailty, other than alcohol, was there anything else that led you to suggest that being the Detective Chief Inspector in the SDS was a salutary lesson in terms of human frailty?
No, I suppose I was I was quite fortunate during my tenure on the squad that there hadn't been any other incidents. That was the only one that occurred during the time I was on the unit.
So in what sense was it a salutary lesson in terms of human frailty in that case?
A salutary lesson in trying to identify, if you like, what the root causes may have been that led this officer to drink to excess to the point of getting himself arrested.
Sorry, I'm sorry. You go on.
It was a salutary lesson in the need to be more watchful, more cognizant of their behaviours. And there's very little clues given before something like this happens. If somebody, for example, has got a drink problem, it may not always manifest itself in sort of in most obvious ways. So I'm not sure that there's an awful lot more. Well, again, looking back, I don't think there's very much more that really I could have done, if you like, to ameliorate or to prevent this sort of thing happening. It is evidence of human frailty, of course it is. But how do we deal with that if the officers are working remotely and you don't have any inkling of what's happening or might happen? No, I'm quite relaxed about it. I don't have I can't see how we could have prevented something like that from happening.
If officers, just like any other individual, are subject to what you refer to as human frailty, would you agree that relying on their common sense and their subjective assessments of how to behave wasn't adequate? They needed more guidance than that, didn't they?
I mean, I hear what you say, but I think, goodness sake, they're grown men. They should know better. They know right from wrong. And there's only so much you can do to sort of wet nurse them, but I don't really see how much more one could do to prevent this, because, as I say, they're mature enough and old enough. They should know how to behave.
Do you accept, looking back now and the evidence that's before the inquiry, that a number of the officers under your command don't appear to have been able to identify right from wrong, or if they did, were willing to do the wrong thing?
Yes, I'm afraid, sadly.
When you said that being in the SDS was a salutary lesson in terms of human frailty, did you have in mind at all the topic of officers entering into sexual relationships?
Goodness me, no.
You don't consider that to be the result of human frailty?
No, absolutely not.
Do you consider that in entering into sexual relationships, undercover officers exploited, as it were, an opportunity that was there for them to exploit?
Yes.
So I'm about to move on to a slightly different topic, so I wonder, although we started a little late, if that's a convenient moment.
Forgive me. Certainly. And we now break for a quarter of an hour to enable the transcribers to have a break, and you, for that matter.
Sure.
Thank you.
All rise.
Thank you. Mr. MacLeod, I want to move on to ask you about the aspect of the officers choosing their identities, which involved the use of the identities of deceased children. Could we have on screen, please, your witness statement at page 45, paragraph 99? And you describe there that undercover officers would spend 6 to 8 months in the back office developing their legends. They would also visit Somerset House, and from time to time they might visit anywhere else that they needed to go in order to find accommodation or familiarise themselves with the area. In the time that you were the Detective Chief Inspector of the unit, I've mentioned 3 officers recruited, HN87, John Dines, and HN25. Were any checks conducted by you or anyone in the office, to your knowledge, about the families of the deceased children whose identities were used by those officers?
No.
Were you aware that those officers would be selecting for their cover identities the identities of deceased children?
I discovered that when I went on the unit.
Right, so not known to you before you joined the unit, but known to you once you had joined?
Yes.
Did you ever address your mind to whether that approach, adopting the identity of a deceased child, was legal?
No, I didn't.
Did you ever seek reassurance from anyone else within the unit or outside and above the unit about the legality or propriety of that approach?
No, I didn't. However, I did feel uncomfortable about it.
At the time? And can you explain what it was that made you feel uncomfortable?
Just the very idea that this should occur. Well, you know, having said that, this was a system that had been set up many years before, and regardless of my particular views, it was the system, and it was designed to provide maximum protection for the undercover officers in building up their legend. So no, although I had some personal qualms about it, I just accepted that that was how things were done.
Did you ever reflect on whether it was in fact the most secure, the safest way for them to select an identity?
No.
Were you aware of an officer who had been deployed in the 1970s in the SDS by the name of Rick Clark?
Yes.
Did you know he'd been an undercover officer in the SDS?
Yes.
And did you know, or did you hear information to the effect that whilst deployed he had been presented with his own death certificate in his cover identity?
I didn't know that, but I learnt this long after I left the police.
After you left the police?
Yeah. Yeah, he was working down in Canary Wharf, and he was managing a.
I'm not, just in case there's anything sensitive in it, I won't ask you about what he was doing in the police at another stage.
Yeah, sure.
But you were no longer in the police when you learnt about that.
No.
The inquiry has heard some evidence, just off the topic of a deceased child's identity for a moment, but some evidence that Rick Clark was regarded as something of a ladies' man. Does that chime with what you knew about him?
Yes.
Was that something that was widely, I say known, but was it widely in circulation? It wasn't a secret?
There wasn't a secret.
So you... Oh, I'm just being asked if you wouldn't mind just sitting forward a little bit to assist with the microphone picking up your
So
voice.
sorry.
Not
So
at
sorry.
all.
Yep.
Right, so going back then to the selection of deceased children's identities, nothing came to your attention to cause you to think that it wasn't in fact the safest and most secure way to select an identity?
That's right.
Did you consider ever simply that an officer might make up a completely fake identity?
Well, that was the only way that we're going to be able to obtain that information, that identity.
But if they simply made up a fake identity, so you may or may
Yes.
not know that in
Oh.
the 1990s, the use of deceased children's identities in the early 90s was phased out by the SDS, and officers used fake identities rather than using a deceased child's identity. Is that something you considered doing whilst you were in post?
No.
And why not?
Frankly, it never occurred to me. It was the status quo, and I said before, whatever qualms I might have about it, however distasteful and shocking it might be, that's how it was. That was the system.
Did you give any thought to the potential impact on the families, the surviving families of the deceased children, whose identities were used?
I think when it hit the media, I think it was probably then I realised just how abhorrent the situation was. So, but when serving, no, it didn't occur to me at all. I just went along with the status quo.
Specifically, did you ever think, for example, about what might happen in the event of an undercover officer being arrested and getting a criminal record in the name of the deceased child, or having a warrant issued for their arrest, what the impact at the time might have been on the families if the police had knocked on their door looking for their deceased relative?
Yes, but I understand the question, but I'm not sure that occurred to me at the time.
You refer there in paragraph 99 of your witness statement to the officers might have visited anywhere else that they needed to go in order to find accommodation or familiarise themselves with the area. When you say the area, do you mean the area into which they were going to be deployed? The geographical location?
I think the geographical location, yes.
Were there ever visits, to your knowledge, by undercover officers to the area where the deceased child, whose identity they were taking, where that child had been born?
I wasn't aware.
Or to places where the surviving family were residing?
No.
So you were never asked to authorise or approve any such visits?
No, not at all. I guess it was because it was the it had been the practice that had been established some time before, so no, it never occurred to me.
It never occurred to you that they might make such visits, do you mean?
Yeah.
And to your knowledge, did they in fact make any such visits, the officers that were preparing to deploy whilst you were in charge?
I can't remember. I can't be sure.
Would it have been something of note to you if they had come to you and said, I want to go to the location where the surviving family lives to check it out? Would you?
Probably not. Probably not. I would just have accepted that this is what they're doing to reinforce the identity.
To what extent did you consider it necessary for officers to look into the surviving families of the deceased child in order to reinforce their legend? Did that seem legitimate to you?
Well, looking back now, the answer to that would be a yes, but at the time, that's how it was. That's how it was. It was
I just clarify that answer. What I asked you was whether you considered it necessary for the officers to look into the families of the deceased children, whether that was a legitimate thing to do. And your answer was, looking back now, yes. Do you mean now you think it was legitimate and necessary, but at the time you didn't consider it?
yes, I think that is true.
And why would it be legitimate or necessary to look into the family of the deceased child whose identity they were going to use?
I really don't know what the reasoning behind it was, where the inquiry would go that far in terms of researching the relatives of the deceased. I don't know how necessary that would have been, but if it had happened, it was obviously deemed at the time to be an appropriate thing to do.
Did you give it any thought at the time?
I wouldn't have known at the time.
Was there ever any question or suggestion raised about an undercover officer having more than one cover identity?
No, absolutely not.
So it was used and deployed after you had left the unit, but the inquiry has evidence to suggest, for example, that John Dines used the identity of a second deceased child. Is that the sort of thing that you ever became aware of?
I didn't become aware of that at all.
Had you become aware of it, would you have had a view on whether it was the right thing to do, the wrong thing to do?
No, I think I only became aware of that sometime later.
And do you have a view on whether it was appropriate?
Frankly, no.
So it wouldn't have caused you any concern necessarily if an officer under your command had sought out a second identity from a deceased child to use?
Oh, yes, it would.
It would have caused you concern?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And why would it have caused you concern?
I'd need to be convinced there was a necessity for it.
So you'd want to know whether it was necessary to use it.
Correct.
So there might be circumstances you can envisage in which it would be, but you'd want to inquire into it.
Exactly.
Thank you. Can we move, please, to the topic of how SDS intelligence reports were written and handled within the unit? And can we have up on the screen, please, page 60, paragraph 121 of your witness statement? And you said this, Mr. MacLeod: no instructions were given to UCOs as to what intelligence should and should not be recorded in reports, to my knowledge. Their understanding about what should or should not be included came from their special branch background. Are you able to assist as to what in their special branch background would have assisted undercover officers to judge what was and wasn't useful intelligence or appropriate intelligence?
No, there's no instructions given to what intelligence should and should not be recorded in reports.
And how were the undercover officers to judge what to include and not to include if they weren't given any guidance or instructions?
I believe that probably was the historical practice that had been sort of, if you like, handed down through the years. And for that reason, there was no reason to question that.
Right, but an undercover officer deployed in a long-term deployment was going to come across day to day a large amount of information about the people with whom they were associating, weren't they?
Yes.
And that put them in a different position from when they might have been performing a desk-based role within Special Branch. Do you agree?
Yes.
So there was a choice for them to make, wasn't there, about what information it was useful to commit to writing an intelligence report and what information was of no policing interest.
Well, that would be their judgment as to what is appropriate and what is not.
So that was left entirely to the undercover officer and
Yes.
was not the subject of guidance from you or the office?
No.
Did you ever give officers any feedback? For example, if they had included something in a report that you considered unhelpful or irrelevant or inappropriate, would you have raised that with them?
I would have done had that happened, but I can't ever recall that happening.
Could we have a look at paragraph 126, please, of your witness statement, page 62? And it says this: I have been asked whether I had sight of every intelligence report or only those which I signed off. I made a conscious effort to read as much of the reporting as I could, though I could not read all the reports. Obviously, the team would flag anything of particular significance as a priority for me. It is not only useful to get an insight into what was happening, but also some sense of the effort that each UCO put into their reporting style, credibility, etc. Are you able to give any idea of the proportion of reporting that you either read completely or had flagged to you for your attention?
No, I can't remember.
Who in the team would flag things of particular significance to you? Would that be Eric Docker or also potentially the detective sergeants?
I would have said Eric Docker would have informed me.
Did individual undercover officers ever flag to you particular intelligence that they were reporting as being of significance as far as they were concerned?
I can't remember.
Can you give any idea of the sort of things that were flagged to you as being of significance? So, for example, was it examples of what was considered to be particularly important intelligence within a field?
Yes, it would have been. It would have been flagged to me.
Was anything ever flagged to you as being an example of substandard report writing by an officer?
No.
Anything flagged to you as being a particularly impressive intelligence from an officer that you can recall?
I would say for the best part of the time, the field officers' writing, reporting was of a fairly high standard. So I never had any reason to question the reporting.
Can I ask you a little bit about the method by which the reports came into existence? As I understand your evidence, it was the individual field officers who wrote their own intelligence reports, is that right?
Yes.
And those reports were written and then handed in at the meetings, at Safe House meetings?
Yeah.
You say in your witness statement that you did not exercise editorial control over the content of the reporting. Is that right?
Correct.
By which you mean, correct me if I'm wrong, do you mean that you didn't alter the substance of what the field officers reported?
Yep.
Ever?
Not that I can recall. There might have been but I would doubt it. Why would I sort of alter it's a field officer whose product is. I mean, if there was any sort of grammatical errors or syntax, we would alter it. But no, the main text of it would be unadulterated.
Can I ask you, by reference to a paragraph of your witness statement, about some things you said there? Paragraph 128, please, so page 63. If we could just zoom in on the bottom half of the page. You explained there, Mr. MacLeod, that intelligence reports were typed up by one of the detective sergeants, usually Detective Sergeant Chris Hyde, from manuscript versions submitted by UCOs, and the DSs would add any SB Special Branch Registry file references needed as they went. Yep, that's correct?
Yes.
Are you able to say whether the detective sergeants ever exercised any editorial control when they were typing them up?
I don't know the answer. I wouldn't expect. No, it would be. They might have corrected some of the grammar, but they wouldn't have altered the actual main thrust of the report of the intelligence.
And then at paragraph 128A, it was on the screen, sorry. Thank you. At paragraph 128A, that's where you say you didn't exercise editorial control. And then you go on to say this: I do not know if Eric would have exercised any editorial control. That seems to leave open the possibility that he might have. Is that what you intended to convey?
I would have thought he would have picked that up, yeah, if there was a need to correct any of the grammar. But the actual main tenor of the report and intelligence would be unadulterated.
So you wouldn't have expected Eric Docker to alter the substance of the report either?
No, if it was grammatical changes, that would be it. But I don't think the main thrust of the intelligence would be altered.
Could we look at 128B, please, at the bottom of that page? And it reads as follows, Mr. MacLeod: I have been asked to what extent, if any, SDS managers decided that it was not worth typing up reports they considered to be of little intelligence value. As I have said, thought would have to be given about whether an officer's report might simply be shredded as being of no relevance. Ultimately, it was a judgment call for the managers, and you go on to say that your approach was generally to trust the officer's judgment. Do you recall occasions on which officers submitted reports but they were shredded because they were considered simply to be of no relevance at all?
I think that would probably be true.
So there may have been reports that were submitted but never saw the light of day.
If they didn't contain adequate information, intelligence, if it was, and I can't think of a reason why you would shred it. I'm afraid I can't answer that. I'm not sure why.
But you leave open the possibility that it might have happened. Is that a fair?
Well, yes,
summary?
I have to, yeah, because it can't be certain.
The inquiry has received evidence from some undercover officers to the effect that they reported certain information, certain details, and that doesn't appear in their written reporting. And they have surmised that that might be because management removed the detail. Do you consider that to be a possible explanation?
Well, I've never myself altered, that I can recall, I've never, during my time there, altered any of the reports. But again, Eric would have seen them first, and if it's grammatical errors, then fair enough. But the substance of the report, I would expect to remain unchanged.
You refer elsewhere in your statement to editing and sanitising of reports. Can you explain what you mean by sanitising of reports?
Well, if it's considered the information is not relevant, you have to make a judgment whether or not it's worthy of recording. And it might be necessary in certain circumstances to sanitise.
So does sanitise mean removing irrelevant information, in your mind?
In my mind, yes.
We have a look, please, at paragraph 129D on page 67. This is in a section about the dissemination of intelligence, Mr. MacLeod. And you say this: in my time, intelligence on serious events was never withheld on the basis that disseminating such material might require an officer to go to court and give evidence, thus leading to their early withdrawal. So does it follow from that you would not have removed any information nor taken the decision not to disseminate it, simply on the basis that it might end up going before a court?
Yeah. I think what's in there, I know that there were several occasions where that predicament, where an officer might have to go to court or leading to their early withdrawal. I can't remember the circumstances in which I would have said that.
Let me ask, perhaps in this way: if a report had crossed your desk containing intelligence that caused you to think, hang on a minute, this officer might end up in court given what's being reported, would you have done anything differently from usual with that intelligence, or would you have signed off the report and allowed it to be disseminated in the ordinary way?
I think I would have allowed it to go ahead in the ordinary way.
Can we look at an example report that you commented on in your witness statement, please? It's MPS 0740088. We'll come back to the substance of it, but I want to ask you about the format of it, please, Mr. MacLeod. If we see that it was Eric Docker who signs the cover sheet, but can I just ask that if we look, please, at the first page, and can we zoom in on paragraphs 1 and 2, please? As I said, we'll come back to the substance of this, Mr. MacLeod, but we see there's a paragraph 1 describes events between the 6th of January 1985 and the 20th of May, 46 incendiary device attacks carried out by members of the ALF, etc. And then at the bottom of paragraph 1, this phrase, the following information concerning the future of this campaign of economic sabotage has been received from a secret and reliable source. And then paragraph 2 begins with a set of quotation marks. Do we take it from the way that report is set out that the intelligence that came from the undercover officer, in this case Bob Lambert, is what we see from paragraph 2? Or would Bob Lambert also have drafted paragraph 1? Are you able to say? Sorry, so this is your B13A.
No, I mean, I cannot say, I can't be sure.
All right, so we shouldn't take the quotation marks necessarily as delineating between information directly from the undercover officer and information from elsewhere.
Yes.
And then can we look, please, at paragraph 7 of this report, which you commented on in your witness statement. Sorry, next page, thank you. At the end of this report, there's a paragraph submitting a list of all incendiary devices prepared by Arnie. And when you commented this on this in your witness statement, you seemed to be suggesting that it was clear that this information was not from the undercover officer but had been added. By somebody with access to the Arnie list.
Yeah, it would appear so, yeah.
All right, thank you. I'll come back to the substance of that later. I'm going to ask, please, that we look now at an example of reporting by an undercover officer who was under your command. It's UCPI 020148. It's not in your primary bundle, sir. It's a report dated the 22nd of April of 1987, and it's attributable to the officer Stefan Scott. And can we look, please, at paragraph, first of all, at paragraphs 1 and 2, just to orientate ourselves. It appears to be a report responding to a request from the security service, identifying members of the Hackney South branch of the Socialist Workers' Party. And then if we look, please, at paragraph 4, amongst the information reported by Stefan Scott was this, that a female employed in a particular department somewhere is described as 5'4" tall, plump build, pretty face, short fair hair, and possessing a slow regional accent. The use of the descriptor pretty face, do you have an observation now on whether that was an appropriate way to describe this individual?
It's certainly not offensive.
It's a subjective descriptor, isn't it? It
Yeah.
depends on, it's not necessarily useful to identify somebody
No.
because it's entirely subjective, isn't it?
Yeah.
And would you agree that it is, to some extent at least, a judgment on someone's appearance?
Oh, it's certainly that, yes.
Does it trouble you at all that undercover officers were commenting on the perceived attractiveness of women in their intelligence reporting?
I am a bit, yes.
And why? Can you explain why?
To say it's misogynistic, maybe went a bit far. There's no necessity to put in a pretty face unless you're going to continue and qualify that by. But no, it doesn't really add to the sum total of the report. It's not necessary.
Should the inquiry understand from seeing this sort of observation included in an intelligence report that the culture of the SDS as a unit was such that these sorts of judgments and descriptors were applied to women generally?
I don't know whether it's applied generally, but it's not. It's probably it's more of a comment on the time in the 1980s when language like this was probably seen to be acceptable, although in our present climate, no, it's not.
So did the culture of the SDS reflect then that sort of culture that you're describing?
I think it's true to say yes.
Was it common for SDS officers or managers in your time to comment on the attractiveness of women being reported on?
It certainly wasn't in my time. I can't ever remember making a comment like that, whether it's intended to be complimentary or derogatory. I don't think there's any need.
Did you hear others in the unit speaking of the attractiveness or otherwise of women who were being reported on, even if you didn't apply those descriptors yourself?
I didn't, no.
Can we take that report down, please, and look at another example? I'm going to ask this through your witness statement because I can't show you the report itself. Page 72, paragraph 141. Right, and you were shown in the course of giving your witness statement a report in which there was a comment that a new member of the group is, quote, very attractive, and you were asked whether officers were encouraged to report such information. You said this: UCOs were encouraged to report on members' appearances for identification purposes, but this is too subjective and unnecessary even by the standards of the time. And you say at the bottom of that paragraph, people today have got higher expectations of public bodies and the police are open to greater public scrutiny than they were. Firstly, do I understand your evidence there to suggest that even by the standards of the 1980s as you experienced them, commenting on the attractiveness of an individual of a woman was not necessary in special branch intelligence reporting.
Yeah.
And as to what you say at the bottom of that paragraph about the police being open to greater public scrutiny, is it your view that it's public scrutiny that keeps the police on the straight and narrow, as it were, with this sort of thing? Or is that to misunderstand your evidence?
I think it was a fair comment.
You think the high levels of secrecy around the SDS was a factor in either encouraging or permitting officers to behave in ways that might not have been acceptable? So the secrecy afforded them a cloak for behaviour that in other areas of work, more public areas of work, might have been called out?
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment.
You comment a bit further down in your witness statement that you find the level of intrusion in this sort of comment troubling with the benefit of hindsight. At the time that you served, do you want me to put it on the screen, Mr. MacLeod?
Yes, please.
Paragraph 142, please. So there is nothing further I can add about the purpose of reporting personal information such as that seen in the reports referred to. And then at subparagraph C, I've been asked whether the reporting was justified. I believe that we thought it was at the time. However, with the benefit of hindsight, I find the level of intrusion troubling. And you're commenting there on a series of reports, including the two I've just gone through with you. Is it right that at the time this sort of reporting didn't stand out to you at all?
Well, retrospectively, yes, it does stand out, but at the time, probably not.
Right, thank you. Could we have up on screen now, please, paragraph 204 of your witness statement, page 113. I want to ask you, Mr. MacLeod, about legal professional privilege and reporting on matters connected to that. We'll have to have that up, please, and over the page as well. Thank you. Right. We'll have to go over. I'll start here, Mr. MacLeod. Paragraph 204, you were asked about any reporting on LPP, legal professional privilege, and you said you were aware of the concept when you were a manager through CID courses which were part of police training. I'm not going to ask you, in fact, about subparagraph A because the redactions make it rather difficult to do so, but could we have a look, please, over the page? We take that down. Thank you. You gave your view on a report that was shown to you, and then you say this at subparagraph B, I would be uncomfortable with sanctioning anything that troubled me as being legally privileged. I would prefer to have it removed from the report. If it smacked of breach of legal privilege, I would have been very uneasy. There would be reputational repercussions if it became known. So when you were managing the unit, you were confident that you were able to spot legally privileged information based on your training, is that right?
Correct.
Do you recall ever seeing anything that troubled you as being privileged?
I can't remember.
If you had, you seem to be saying that you might have removed that information from the report, is that right?
Yes.
So in that sense, you might have exercised some editorial control by removing information?
Yes, on something like that, yes.
And so you considered, am I right to suggest you considered that it was inappropriate for officers to be reporting legally privileged information?
Absolutely.
You say there, you suggest there that there would be reputational repercussions if it became known that privileged information had been reported. Was there anything other than the reputation of the unit that concerned you about the reporting of privileged information?
Yes, it'd be fundamentally wrong. In fact, it'd be breaking the law.
Can we take that down and look, please, at paragraph 205 on that page, at the bottom, thank you. You say in your statement, Mr. MacLeod, that there was no policy, instruction or guidance concerning undercover officers coming into possession of legally privileged information. You would expect to have been made aware of a policy if it had existed. And then you say you would have taken it up with a more senior officer if you'd seen it in a report. If there was no policy, instruction or guidance concerning officers coming into possession of legally privileged information, did you take any steps to guide them as to the undesirability of including such information in their reports?
Well, I would most certainly have taken up with a more senior officer, that's for sure.
As to how undercover officers would know, or if they would know, that it was deemed unacceptable to report that information, how would they know that in the absence of any instruction or policy?
I would have it was self-evident if they're trying to report, if they are reporting legally privileged information,
50, both minutes included.
Thank you. Mr. MacLeod, we'll carry on. I've got to ask you specifically about whether or not during the Safe House meetings or at any other time, undercover officers ever asked to access the special branch files of individuals. Were you asked for that access by the officers? If it assists you in your witness statement, you say you can't remember an officer asking.
No, I can't remember.
Would it have surprised you, or would
Yes.
it have been routine?
It would have surprised me.
And does it follow from that that it wasn't routine for undercover
Was it-
officers to access special branch files once they were
To the best of
deployed?
my recollection, no, it wasn't routine. Having said that, I can't be 100% certain on that answer. The answer is I'm not sure. To the best of my recollection, I can't recall any of these files being brought out. They're classified and they do not leave the building. So special branch reports would not have been allowed into the safe houses.
You've described how these meetings offered an opportunity to the officers that was, as it were, apart from their undercover lives. So they were back socialising with other police officers at these meetings. What's your view looking back on how adequate they were to you, how useful they were to you as a means of supervising the officers under your command?
They were crucial.
And can you explain why you regarded them as crucial?
Just the camaraderie alone, and talking and with colleagues, talking in police language about a multitude of things. Because bear in mind, they're away from their place of work. They're not mixing with police officers, the colleagues. And it's a safety valve for them. So it was a valuable, very valuable sort of exercise. And that's why we had 2-day meetings twice a week.
And from your point of view as the person who was responsible for supervising them, to what extent did it permit you to fulfil a supervisory function over them?
That's the only way I could. The meetings twice a week, that's the only way I could have any kind of supervisory sort of.
Would it be fair or not to say that in that forum you were reliant on the officers to be forthcoming with you about what they were doing?
Yes.
It didn't provide you with much insight into what they were doing beyond what they were willing to share with you. Is that fair?
I think it's a fair comment, yes.
Did you take any steps to supervise them in a way that wasn't solely reliant on what they were willing to tell you?
No.
In terms of the welfare of the undercover officers under your command, to what extent did the meetings help you to take care of their welfare or monitor their welfare?
Yeah, I felt quite strongly about that. The welfare was, well, my role is as much a pastoral one as anything else. And I saw that as my opportunity to take testings to see what's happening and to get a flavour of the mood and so forth. So it's very important.
And how well do you think, looking back, you were able to assess the welfare of individual officers through those meetings?
Well, looking back, and again with 20/20 hindsight, I wish it could have been done better. that,
What-
that was the only comment I'd make. That yes, I mean, it's a very difficult. There was a very difficult bunch of officers because the strains that they're living under in the role they're playing. It's the only chance they have to vent any kind of feelings or any concerns, and there had been occasions where one-to-one meetings took place, and these were private meetings with individuals who may have had and did have sort of concerns, domestic concerns, and that was treated confidentially, and that remains even now.
So by that, as I understand it, you're referring to issues that officers may have been having in their real personal lives.
Correct.
Rather than in the course of their undercover deployment, is that right?
Right.
So those you monitored in part through discussions at the meetings, the weekly meetings, twice weekly. Is that right? If I understood
That's
correctly?
Yeah.
In terms of their welfare arising from their undercover deployment directly, what's your view on how useful the meetings were for monitoring that?
Well, that's the only one we had. We didn't have any other way of monitoring them.
You refer in your witness statement, I can bring it up if you like, but you refer to becoming aware that later on officers were given access to a military psychiatrist. I think that happens in the 1990s, well after your time. And you commented that that would have been beneficial for the officers you managed. Do you remember saying that?
Yeah, very much.
In what ways and why do you think that would have been beneficial?
Well, I think there aren't too many tools open to you really when it comes to this type of thing, and trying to get into somebody's head. That was something I gained. I'm not sure whether it was Bramshill or whether it was Hendon or wherever. This psychometric testing it hadn't been universally adopted, but later did become, or a similar system. But psychometric testing came in, I think, after I left the police. I'm not sure what year it came in.
But what did you see as the benefit, or what do you see as the benefit to undercover officers in having, for example, access to a psychiatrist as they go through their deployments? What could that add that you couldn't provide?
Well, they're in a very good position to comment on the welfare, the mental health of the officers, which is something that I couldn't do or anybody else could do. So that's what that would be a distinct advantage, because mental health did feature quite prominently at various times throughout the years of the SDS.
You also say in your witness statement that if there had been the opportunity for post-field counselling for your officers, so after they came out of the field, you say, I would have jumped on it. Again, is that for similar reasons?
Yes.
And that was not available to the officers who were under your command?
I think that came later.
Did it occur to you at the time that it might be useful for the officers to have access to counselling after their deployments are concluded, or is that something you've thought about with hindsight?
No, I think, I stand corrected, but I think Tony Waite introduced it. The buddy-buddy system, where an experienced former undercover officer would be assigned to individuals
Yes,
to
you-
keep in touch with the first 6 months, 8 months of coming out after leaving the unit. So that I think that was a step in the right direction. It provided a near for the officers, and it was something I applauded, in fact advocated. But I can't remember if it came in before I left. I'm not sure. But to answer your question, yes, it's invaluable.
I will pick that back up with you, if I may, after the lunch break, because I've got a little bit more to go on this topic, and I'm not going to finish it now.
We'll resume a minute or two after 2.